Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is October 3rd, 2018. Tonight, a triple shot. A dead stop, a new start, and a reset of the big game. 3 events, 3 different results in 3 different environments, but there's a lot in common with what the problems are. The dead stop. New Brunswick will carry on with an interim caretaker government as a result of election results, as the 4 parties in play continue to try and make a deal to be in on the new government. Gallant is still premier after he presents a throne speech, see if he can carry the confidence of the House. Now, by tradition and convention only, not by rules. That is his right, as the Lieutenant Governor has affirmed. But it's done nothing to limit the gamesmanship in the media from all the party leaders. Blaine Higgs continues to insist his PC party should get first crack at forming government, while Kris of People's Alliance and David Coon of New Brunswick Green Party pimp out their 3 seats apiece as Kingmakers. The new start. For the first time in a half century, separation is not a front burner issue in Quebec government. Coalition Avenir Quebec roared to a majority win, running on quote-unquote Quebec Values, not independence. While steady as she goes, federalist liberal power was rebuked outside of Metro Montreal. The Parti Quebecois is without official party status, as leader Jean-Francois Lisee lost his own seat and resigned after the worst showing for the party since 1970. Quebec Solidaire broke out of its Montreal base and finished ahead of the PQ, in effect becoming the de facto separatist party in the province, with a strong left platform. The big game reset. Well, the new NAFTA is here, but it's called the USMCA, apparently. United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, and was pulled out of the fire just in time for the outgoing Mexican government to ratify it before power changes hands and moves decidedly to the left, which will avoid any reopening of the deal in Mexico. But when that is the big deadline motivation, how great could the deal be? Well, when I wrote this show page, I said, get ready for the non-stop partisan chatter out of Ottawa. Well, it's well underway for the foreseeable future. Yippee! The more things change, Oh, But let's get to the dead stop. Now, everything I'm going to cover has come out since the election. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is read an editorial from the Chronicle Herald. New Brunswick election puzzle leaves Liberals on life support. Premier Brian Gallant and the Liberals decisively won the popular vote with 37.8%. But they won only 21 seats in the 49-seat legislature, leaving them well short of a majority. The Liberals piled up huge numbers in some of the ridings they won, mostly in Francophone-dominant North and East New Brunswick. But their vote was insufficient. Many votes produced proportionally fewer wins. The Progressive Conservatives under Blaine Higgs captured 22 seats, but only 31.9% of the vote, efficiently producing more seats with fewer votes. But this leaves no party with a mandate to govern on its own. In effect, New Brunswickers have voted for all of the above. Now, the election was extraordinary in other ways, too. It produced the first minority government in New Brunswick since 1920. It elected 11 women out of 49 seats, an all-time high. But at 67%, turnout was the second lowest ever. And more significantly, emerging parties will have an outsized impact on the new Legislative Assembly. With only 12% of the vote each, they hold the balance of power. The Greens re-elected their popular leader, David Coon, and 2 more MLAs. The People's Alliance Party, led by Kris went from 0 to 3 seats. New Democratic Party support collapsed to 5% and no seats. Gallant visited Lieutenant Governor Jocelyn Roy-Villeneuve last Tuesday, and said he had obtained vice-regal consent to face the legislature in a new session. The Liberals are still the government, and I am still the Premier, Gallant said, until the Liberals lose the confidence of the House. That's true, but the math is not working with him. Just winning over the Greens or the People's Alliance, Gallant will still leave the Liberals 1 short of 25. He needs 4 votes from somewhere if his government is going to survive. Higgs is not in power, but in a strong political situation nevertheless. He only needs support from one of the smaller parties for a majority of votes and command of the agenda. The Tories have a natural affinity with the People's Alliance. Social conservatives, who want to change how New Brunswick provides services in both official languages. And let's remember that leader of the PCs, Blaine Higgs, is a former member of the Anti-Bilingualism Confederation of Regions Party. Drink break. The Tory leader said Monday that New Brunswickers want the parties to work together, and the PCs will try to make minority government work. But his caucus is in a position to frustrate much of the Liberal program if it chooses. Higgs only needs a little help from the Greens or the Alliance on any matter of confidence to sink the Liberals. For now, Gallant is dealing from the Premier's office, but Higgs holds most of the cards. How he plays those cards will have a big impact on the next election, which might not be far down the road. I turn to the Canadian press, who talk about how the election reveals New Brunswick linguistic divide. It is the most corrosive wedge issue in Canada's only officially bilingual province, language. Largely dormant for more than 20 years, the schism between French and English-speaking New Brunswickers reappeared this week when voters cast their ballots along linguistic lines, creating a starkly contrasting electoral map. Monday's vote saw the election of 3 members of the upstart People's Alliance, marking a breakthrough for a populist party that campaigned on a quote-unquote common sense platform that includes pledges that are wildly unpopular with French-speaking voters. Maybe it's common sense for them, but it's clear from the Francophone perspective that Francophones will never vote for this party, said Roger Ouellet, a political science professor at the Université de Moncton. Francophones feel this party is against their fundamental linguistic rights. However, Kris, a former church minister, has repeatedly insisted the right-leaning party isn't opposed to bilingualism, which is a protected constitutional right. It's very frustrating for some organizations and other parties to be putting out this fear-mongering and this idea that we are somehow anti-French. We respect the rights of both Francophone and Anglophone citizens to receive government services in their language of choice. What we want to do is make sure that it works in the best interest for all New Brunswickers. The money we're spending on duality can be invested in frontline services while still maintaining the rights of both linguistic communities. Still, there is no shortage of French-speaking critics who have taken aim at Austin's promises to eliminate duality in government services, which include school busing and healthcare. And he wants to do away with the office of the Official Languages Commissioner. With the PCs and incumbent Liberals each failing to secure a majority, Austin now shares the balance of power with the Green Party. That means Austin's once obscure party and its potentially incendiary approach to language in the province is getting a lot more attention than it used to. However, it would be a stretch to suggest support for the People's Alliance has been driven solely by an anti-French bias among Anglophones. That's from Herb Emery, a professor at the UNB in Fredericton. Emery says many of the New Brunswickers who voted for Austin's party were expressing their frustration with the PCs and the Liberals, who have presided over a two-party state for almost 100 years. It's a protest vote, he said. People just didn't know where to go. There was a feeling emerging that the two main parties weren't speaking about the important issues: the deficit crisis, crumbling infrastructure, the lack of job opportunities, out-migration. To be sure, both the Tories and Liberals saw their support drop during the course of the campaign. And that discontent has prompted some voters to lash out at the status quo, and in some cases, their neighbors. When you have an economy that is struggling, you're always looking for a scapegoat. It could be newcomers, refugees. Here, in New Brunswick, they pick on the linguistic divide. Ouellet says the renewed schism between French and English is reflected in voting patterns. A swath of red, Liberal seats can be seen across the province's northern and eastern reaches, showing how closely aligned the party is with Francophone voters. In the center of the province and to the south, it's all Tory blue, with a few hints of Alliance purple, areas dominated by the majority Anglophone population. Ouellet says the map today wasn't all that different in 1991, when the anti-bilingualism Confederation of Regions Party won 8 seats, forming the official opposition. It's a return to this kind of party, says Ouellette, adding that Francophone voters avoided voting for the PCs on Monday because party leader Blaine Higgs doesn't speak much French and was once a member of the COR party. Last Wednesday, Austin said he was open to formally supporting a PC government, though he wouldn't say if there was a policy they had to adopt to secure his support. Such a coalition might seem like a natural fit, but the Tories were made aware last Wednesday that they could be swallowing a poison pill. Robert Gauvin, the only Francophone in the new Conservative caucus, said he won't support his own party if it adopts the language policies of the People's Alliance. Gauvin told Brunswick News, "For me, it's clear Higgs' longevity as Premier will depend on the way he treats Acadians. My job is to ensure that our rights are respected. We can't go back on what we've earned." But Blaine Higgs insists from his viewpoint, Gauvin is fully on side to the deal. Oh, yeah. What about Kris Austin and the People's Alliance? It's from the CBC. Gabriel Fahme. This was September 27th. So, just after the election. 14 Acadian associations and the mayors of 19 municipalities have signed a letter opposing any coalition that involves the People's Alliance. Kris Austin, the party leader, said that's unfortunate and believes his party has been misunderstood. Liberal and Green Party leaders have also been categorical in rejecting any notion of aligning with the People's Alliance on the basis of the language elements of their platform. And so is the Conservatives' only elected Francophone candidate, Robert Gauvin. It's just really unfortunate that that's what's being perpetuated by some people out there. I think it's fear-mongering among some elite groups, said Kris Austin. The Official Languages Act was passed nearly 50 years ago by the Louis Robichaud government, giving New Brunswickers the option to receive public services in the language of their choice. Now, Austin campaigned on a platform that would see Francophone and Anglophone health authorities merge, duality in school busing come to an end, and the office of the Official Languages Commissioner abolished. The party also wants to eliminate bilingual requirements for public service jobs in regions where there's no demand for one of the languages. Now, Austin has said that he will not compromise on that, citing a reduction in ambulance wait times would be the result. We're not asking to dilute minority rights, he said. We respect the rights of both French and English in this province. What we're asking for is let's apply some common sense to how we make this work. There's those two words together again. They never mean what you think they do or what they should. Austin, who said he was baffled by the comments he's heard from Francophone groups since the election, believes ambulance services are in crisis, something he blames in part on bilingual requirements leaving jobs unfilled. But he said that doesn't make him anti-Francophone. We're saying we'll do whatever it takes to make sure paramedics show up in a decent amount of time, said Austin. Robert Melanson is the president of the Acadian Society of New Brunswick. I have a quote from Mr. Melanson. That is, for me, bullshit. When you're against duality, you're against bilingualism. You're against everything. You're not for the equality. Melanson's group is one of 14 that signed a letter against any coalition scenario involving the People's Alliance. It would be a terrible historic error for any political party that would do that, because I think that would be a stigma that would stay on a political party. The mayors of 19 municipalities, from Memramcook in the southeast to Edmundston in the northwest, also signed. Dieppe Mayor Yvon Lapierre was one of them. I'm concerned that Francophones in this province will lose rights that they have acquired over many years. I think the words of common sense approach is a trap, essentially. I think there's a sense with people, particularly in rural New Brunswick, that they have lost something. I think it's quite to the contrary when we look at the benefits of bilingualism that have brought to our economy locally. He cited the example of jobs being brought with the Toronto Dominion call center in Dieppe because of the bilingual workforce. Bilingualism is bringing over $1.4 billion to New Brunswick every year. It's a populist party that is trying to put the economic blame on the Acadians, and that is not right. And Mr. Melanson adds, bilingualism, by the way, is here to stay. So there is a definite line in New Brunswick, to a different degree than Ontario, to a different degree than the opposition in Alberta and BC, to a different degree than what you get out of Saskatchewan government. It's very clear what that line is and what pictures they're not afraid for people to put together. Populist. From September 28th, Kris Austin met with Lieutenant Governor Jocelyn Roy-Vienneau on Friday morning to discuss working with other parties in the legislature. PC leader Blaine Higgs says there is no deal between his party and the People's Alliance to form government, despite suggestions of the same by Premier Brian Gallant and a statement from the People's Alliance. People's Alliance leader Kris Austin agreed to provide stability for a PC minority government on a bill-by-bill basis for 18 months. Higgs said he spoke to Austin about stabilizing for government, but made no formal agreement. Austin said he met with the Lieutenant Governor to inform her he'd met with Higgs and had discussed working with other parties in legislature and to let her know about the party's decision. We want to give New Brunswickers some confidence that, as we've said all along and we continue to say, we will work with Mr. Higgs and the PC party to go on a bill-by-bill basis to promote stability in government for 18 months. This depends entirely on what Mr. Higgs puts forward and how he's willing to cooperate with us. Premier Gallant wanted to spread like wildfire. There's a deal. There's a deal. You know, you have to stick with me. You're the bad guys are coming. And he was called out for that by Blaine Higgs. Mr. Gallant wants people to believe that I have a secret agenda and I made a deal with the People's Alliance. Again, what you are witnessing is a desperate attempt to hold on to power. Well, well played. Well played. Higgs said he has not met with Austin or his party and there was no coalition, no backroom deal. The PC leader said he spoke to Austin over the phone only. Both Higgs and Austin said no offers on policy have been made or accepted. All Higgs is willing to say that since the Green Party had been given official party status in the last legislature, People's Alliance should be given the same. But that's about as far as he went. Right away, Premier Gallant was quick to jump on that Francophone issue and the single member of the PC caucus. Clearly, Blaine Higgs and Kris Austin have struck a deal. The question is that deal supported by the entire PC caucus and the entire People's Alliance caucus? The Premier attempted to stoke division within the PC party, saying they have already heard from several Tories concerned about dealing with the alliance. Gallant called on progressive Conservative members, emphasizing the word progressive, to take action, from moving against a deal to even, if necessary, crossing the floor. Yeah, I bet. Yeah. Sure, come on over. Let me be government. The Liberal leader said his party will begin formal discussions about a confidence and supply agreement with the Green Party yesterday. He said any deal struck between the two would be made public. Green leader David Coon arranged to have individual phone conversations last Thursday with both Higgs and Gallant to look at what kind of government might be built in the Legislative Assembly. Leader of the Greens, Coon, said he would not make a decision until early October after final election results are confirmed. That's another issue. Now we come to this week, Monday. Blaine Higgs suddenly has ideas. This is from Global. Michael Tutton, Canadian Press. New Brunswick Tory leader says 4-year deal between PCs and third party would be ideal for stable government. On this Monday, Higgs met with Green Party leader David Coon and emerged to say the parties share some common policy, such as improving the openness of government. He also said the Greens are interested in a 4-year agreement, like the one in BC, between the NDP and the Green Party, which states the agreement is in effect until the next fixed election date. Though the BC agreement doesn't guarantee the support of the Greens, it sets out a series of guidelines on how the two parties will work together, and it requires the minority government to hold a referendum on proportional representation. Higgs said the document is maybe more thorough than something his party would sign, but added he'll see where talks go with the Green leader. Higgs told reporters that he likes the idea of a longer-term agreement being floated by the Greens, and he said it was something People's Alliance leader Kris Austin might consider as well. Ideally, that agreement is a 4-year document. And I think if we can find a 4-year commitment, and I think Mr. Austin would also be open to that, because we want stability here in the province, and that's what we're striving for. So it's sure a good thing Mr. Higgs just isn't sure about anything yet, right? It took 48 hours for him to go from no deal, no comment, to, all right, the first guys with a 4-year agreement that we find acceptable. All right, we're in business, we're a government. Of course, after the defeat of the throne speech, etc. But there are still a lot of questions about this hung election. There's no other thing to call it. And this was from right after the election. You know, everybody had to get something out. This again was from the Canadian Press. How is it that Brian Gallant gets a chance to form the government, even if he has fewer seats? Well, in our system, the convention is that the existing premier has the first opportunity to form government. The incumbent premier can always test the legislature, explains Kelly Lamrock, a Fredericton constitutional lawyer and a former New Brunswick Liberal cabinet minister and House leader. Theoretically, in 2010, after then Premier Sean Graham lost all but 10 seats, he could have still gone to the Lieutenant Governor and said, I think I can pull this off. And he would have had every right to march into the House and make the opposition turf him. How and when will this attempt to win confidence of the House be tested? Well, it will be the throne speech that will lead to a confidence vote. And if the government wins the vote, that means that the government managed to form a coalition or gain the support of the Assembly. Now, does the clear win of the popular vote matter at all? No. Perhaps it should from a democratic perspective, but in terms of the rules and conventions, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the number of seats. Now, Lamrock said when the popular vote doesn't matter in a legal sense, it could help the optics of Gallant refusing to back down. 6 percentage points in an election this small is sizable. Lamrock suggests that Gallant is trying to signal to the public that rather than pathetically clinging to power, more people voted to make him premier than any other leader. The Liberals will want to protect their brand, and winning the popular vote adds credibility to Gallant holding on to power. Would party alliances need to be explicit to convince the Lieutenant Governor they can govern, or can Gallant indeed try to go vote to vote? If you got a signed, again, this is Lamrock. If you got a signed letter from somebody with 3 seats saying, I've agreed that for 18 months I will not bring down this government on a confidence vote, that becomes a powerful inducement. But, meanwhile, instead of a formal pact to work together for a set period of time, the Premier could go vote to vote. That is highly unstable and could trigger another election, something no one will likely want. Could a recount change the electoral outcome? Well, in New Brunswick, a recount is triggered automatically if there are 25 votes or less separating the winning candidate. But candidates can request a recount even if there is a bigger margin. There are 3 ridings under contention with recounts. Is there a possibility of another election coming sooner rather than later? Yes, there is. But, again, as was said, elections cost money. Elections make the markets nervous. It's, New Brunswick's up against a wall anyway, financially. They don't need this kind of shit. They got to work it out. Somebody's got to win. That's the deal. Michael McDonald from Canadian Press talking about the unwritten rules. There's absolutely no precedent within New Brunswick because the last time this was an issue was in the 1920s. Having faced similar challenges in the past, the parliaments in the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand have all spelled out their post-election conventions in so-called cabinet manuals. Now, talking to Duff Conacher of Democracy Watch. They haven't had any problems with their minority government parliament since. Why? Because everybody knows the rules. Now, should this happen in Canada? Well, there's a lot of people that say yes. Of course, Duff Conacher is one. Peter Russell, one of Canada's leading constitutional scholars, says cabinet manuals are a good idea. It would reduce uncertainty, but not remove it, said the U of T professor emeritus. In Britain, for example, the cabinet manual clearly states that when an election does not result in a majority for a single party, the incumbent government is entitled to wait until the new parliament has met. to see if it can command the confidence of the House of Commons. But it is expected to resign if it becomes clear it is unlikely to secure enough support. If such a rule was in place here, New Brunswick's Tory leader Blaine Higgs would be prevented from describing himself as Premier-elect, a term that doesn't really exist anyway because premiers are not directly elected. And if a government tried to violate one of those written conventions, the Speaker of the legislature and the Lieutenant Governor would both be justified in denying the request. But since cabinet manual rules are typically non-binding, Duff Conacher and Democracy Watch says it's time for them to be codified, to made into a law. But as soon as you say that, someone says, good luck. Conventions codified as legal rules on the formation of Parliament would probably require a formal constitutional amendment, mainly because such a set of laws would affect the office of the Lieutenant Governors and Governor General. To move to a different system based upon clear and strict rules would really require wholesale constitutional change. It's possible, but it would mean a daunting task of constitutional writing that would open up many other aspects of our system of constitutional government to critical scrutiny. Yeah, well, we know what happens in Canada when you talk about opening the Constitution. Well, I guess that problem is really not so bad anyway. There were only 10, 13, 14, 15 seats out of 49 where the winning candidates in New Brunswick actually got a majority of eligible voters, 50% plus. 10 of them were Liberals. As we went through in the articles, huge margins of victory in basically the Francophone areas to the north and to the east. 10 Liberals had actual majorities in their ridings. 3 Progressive Conservatives. 1 People's Alliance. 1 Green Party. All 4 leaders were elected. All 4 leaders had 50% plus in their ridings. So that's good to see. But first past the post definitely distorted New Brunswick's election results. What I'm going to refer to is an article by Mark Coffin from Springtide NGO. Springtide.ngo is where you can find their material online. How first past the post distorted New Brunswick's election results. There are a couple pictures in the slideshow that relate to this article. I could have put more, but just, wow, too much. Seeing it flash for 5 seconds, you're not going to learn anything. We're going to talk about it. Now, despite the fact that Liberal voters outnumbered PC voters by 22,491 votes, the PCs walked away with 22 seats to the Liberals 21. The Greens and the People's Alliance parties collected over 12% of the popular vote each, and both parties won 3 seats apiece. For both parties, this represents a historic breakthrough. However, each party's share of the popular vote is double their share of the seats in the legislature. The failings of first past the post, however, are about much more than the discrepancy between the share of the popular vote each party earned and the share of the seats in the legislature those parties receive. That's just the beginning. Now, I'll just go over the graph here. The PCs got 32% of the vote. They got 45% of the seats. The Liberals got 38% of the vote. They got 43% of the seats. The NDP got 5% of the vote. They got no seat. The Greens had 12% of the vote and got 6% of the seats. People's Alliance had 13% of the vote and got 6% of the seats. Now, Mr. Coffin goes on here to demonstrate how perilous first past the post is in close elections. If 260 Liberal voters in 3 districts change their minds, New Brunswick would have a PC majority. Remember, they are 4 seats short right now. 260 votes. Take the 3 districts where PC candidates lost by the narrowest of margins: St. John Harbour, Fredericton North, and Carleton, Victoria. Take 6 Liberal voters from St. John Harbour, 131 from Fredericton North, and 123 from Carleton, Victoria, and convince them to vote PC. That would be enough to give the Conservatives 25 seats. When you take into the account the 131 for Fredericton North, that's 131 votes less for the Liberal candidate and 131 more for the Conservative. St. John Harbour, 6 voters. That means the Liberal would be reduced to a caucus of 18. PCs would have 25. Green Party and the People's Alliance really wouldn't matter. Now, those changes would have a minimal effect on a popular vote. 260 ballots represents 0.06% of the valid votes cast in the election. Now, if 336 PC voters in 4 districts change their mind, it would be a Liberal majority. Shippagan, Lamec, Miscou, Moncton Northwest, Moncton Southwest, and Oromocto, Lincoln, Fredericton. That's 50 from 1, 112, 127, and 47. If they had switched their votes from PC to Liberal, that would bring the PCs down to 18, give the Liberals at 25, and Green and People's Alliance, so what? 336 votes. That's it. The subtle shifts in voting behavior within a small number of districts can dramatically change what form of government and what party government takes after an election. Such volatility means that district-level polling is extremely valuable for party strategists. It incentivizes politicians to make parochial appeals on issues that only matter to voters in swing districts, even issues that only matter to swing voters in swing districts. More concerning, it makes elections far more vulnerable to the influence of bad actors with the means to conduct district-level polling. But for many partisan strategists, seeing numbers like these is the equivalent of seeing a 4 out of 5 match on a slot machine. Any concerns about the legitimacy of the system and its results are too often overshadowed by the desire to pull the lever again, knowing how close victory actually was. A majority government isn't tens of thousands of votes away. It's just a few hundred. Wow. 53% of voters have a member of the Legislative Assembly today that they did not vote for. Only 47% of voters voted for somebody who actually won. There is a specific case here. If I can turn this goddamn page. The victory of Liberal candidate Jerry Lowe shows how easy it is to get elected under first past the post. 1,865 votes, the fewest votes of all 49 elected candidates. But that's not what makes his victory worth mentioning. he also had fewer votes than 32 losing candidates around the province. And then conversely, Wilfrid Roussel lost the riding of Shippagan-Lamec-Nisku by 99 votes. He collected 3,949 votes of his own to Robert Gauvin's 4,048. That's more votes than any other losing candidate, twice as many as Gary Lowe, and more votes than 35 of the 49 winning candidates. In any sort of proportional representation system, how is this man not elected? The Liberals and the PCs both lost support compared to their own performance in the 2014 election. The Liberals had 15,057 fewer votes and won 6 fewer seats. The PCs earned 7,501 fewer votes, but they gained 1 seat. The Greens gained 20,604 votes and went from 1 to 3 for seats. People's Alliance voting was up 39,896, and they got 3 seats. This is not a system that works correctly. First past the post no longer works. Not that it ever really did, but it can no longer be tolerated. And just today, for my politics and the Canadian press, a third vote recount has been ordered in New Brunswick following an incredibly tight election race last week that left the Liberals and PCs jockeying for power. That riding will be one of them. Another one will be Oromocto, Lincoln, Fredericton, another one mentioned. St. John Harbour, and Memramcook, Tantramar. That is where a Green was elected by 11 over a Liberal. A lawyer for the PC candidates in the St. John district has alleged that about 40 electors voted twice in the riding. Okay. Liberal beat the PC by 10 votes there. The games will go on, and first past the post allows them to go on. Holy shit, did that subject take way too long. Wow. Okay, we may not even get to NAFTA. The New Start. Like I said, for the first time in half a century, separation is not an issue in Quebec. Who are the CAQ? Well, I'm going to start with just a little bit of an overview of the election. It's from CBC. This is from the night of the election, October 1st. Coalition Avenir Quebec, a right-of-center party that has never held power, will form a majority government in Quebec, dealing a historic blow to the incumbent Liberals. In a rowdy victory speech, Premier-designate François Legault said voters had finally set aside the divisive battle over sovereignty that has consumed provincial politics for the last 50 years. Today we have made history. There are many Quebecers who have demonstrated that it is possible to have yesterday's adversaries work together to work for the Quebec of tomorrow together. Yeah, okay. Founded in 2011, the CAQ was the favorite heading into the campaign, though Legault stumbled badly at times, particularly when pressed to explain his controversial plan to cut the number of immigrants accepted by the province. But he regained momentum in the final week of the campaign, much of which he spent in the regions outside Montreal, where he enjoys broad support among key Francophone voters. CAQ won 74 seats, while the Liberals were elected in 32. 63 is the magic number for majority. But the CAQ won only 2 seats on the island of Montreal. Legault, who has proposed building new suburban roads, has not always seen eye to eye with the city's mayor, Valérie Plante, who took power last year on a promise to improve public transit. Now, the CAQ had 37.7% of the popular vote, the lowest amount in Quebec history for a party that won a majority. The Liberals won 24.7%, a historic low. Since Confederation, the Quebec Liberal Party has always obtained at least 30% of the vote, until this last Monday. Now, at the time, Premier Philippe Couillard, his Liberals campaigned on their strong economic record and a promise to improve the everyday lives of Quebecers. But they were criticized for their deep cuts to education and healthcare made in the first 2 years of their mandate as they wrestled to balance the budget. In his concession speech, Couillard, who retained his seat in Lac-Saint-Jean, said he would take a few days to reflect on his political future. Quebecers clearly expressed a desire for change. I wish for Legault's government all the success that Quebec deserves. Despite our significant differences in opinion, we are all Quebecers. We must remain united. Okay. The Parti Quebecois won just 9 seats and only 17% of the popular vote. Those numbers are not enough on either scale to maintain official party status in Quebec. And for the first time in decades, the question of whether Quebec should become independent did not figure prominently in the campaign. With support for sovereignty waning, the Parti Quebecois said during the campaign it would put off holding a referendum until a second mandate. But the party lost votes to another sovereigntist party, the smaller, left-wing Quebec Solidaire, led by 2 popular co-spokespeople, Manon Massé and Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois. The leader of the PQs, Jean-Francois Lisee, lost his own Montreal riding of Rosemont to the Quebec Solidaire's candidate, Vincent Marissal. Quebec Solidaire won 10 ridings, more than tripling its count. Now, their platform, which includes a series of bold environmental proposals, is particularly popular among young voters. In her speech to supporters, spokesperson Manon Massé urged the CAQ to take action to fight climate change. We told you all campaign about the environment. It's now or never. That was the scene. Now, what about the QS? Before we get into what the CAQ says they're going to do. This is from the National Observer, Cecilia Keating. This is from QS party headquarters the night of the election. Quebec Solidaire supporters were jubilant as the party tripled its seats in the National Assembly in the provincial election. One of the party's 2 spokespersons, Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, declared the QS gains a historic victory. The QS rattled election nerves in Quebec as one of its candidates, former La Presse political journalist Vincent Marissal, defeated Parti Québécois leader Jean-Francois Lisee in the Montreal inner-city riding of Rosemont. Marissal took the stage with his 3 daughters and wife, saying it was a huge honor to represent Rosemont. He also encouraged the crowd to be elegant and dignified when they started booing his adversaries in the riding. He thanked Lisee for his service to the riding, and also he thanked him for his service to provincial politics over the last 25 years. Marissal told reporters that he takes no personal satisfaction from beating Lisee. That was not my goal, and not the reason why I jumped into this race. Now, the QS added new ridings to the 3 seats it held when the government was dissolved. Those were the Montreal seats of Mercier, Gallant, and Sainte-Marie-Saint-Jacques. Now, for the first time, QS won seats outside of Montreal. 2 of them, Jean Lesage and Taschereau, are in the Quebec City area. And 1, Rouyn-Noranda-Témiscamingue, is in western Quebec. Laurier-Dorion was taken from the Liberals. Sherbrooke was taken from the Liberals. And Rosemont was taken from the PQ. Questioned later in a media scrum by the National Observer, Nadeau-Dubois said that sovereignty is still alive in Quebec, and if we want it to grow, we need to redefine it. It's what QS has been doing for 12 years. We could have hidden from the idea. The QS was right away saying that they would have preferred to see a minority. Well, gee, do you think? Of course they would. As if what we just talked about in New Brunswick was in demonstration of that. Manon Massé told a crowd in her, "We are no longer the party of the Plateau Montreal." She spoke about how QS had won the first battle, the battle for hope. She then said Premier-designate Legault had a heavy responsibility to lead Quebec into an energy transition because it's too late to wait for another election. They were the only party to have their polling numbers rise from when it started, August 15th, right up to the morning of October 1st. They went from 9.7% on August 15th to 15.1% on September 30th. Now, in May of 2017, the PQ made an offer to merge with Quebec Solidaire. In the boardroom, it was approved. When it went to the membership, the members of Quebec Solidaire said, yeah, no, we know. Don't you think it's a good idea? Pas tellement. And now the PQ is whining that, look, if we would have joined, we could be a force. And QS is saying, you guys are dead. We're the future. It will be interesting. It is the newest development now that CAQ has achieved power so quickly, which is never supposed to happen in Quebec. A new era. What has the CAQ promised? A lot of things. This is from the Montreal Gazette. This is a list. It's got a list here of during the 39-day election campaign where the CAQ stood on the 7 biggest issues. The economy. CAQ said they would standardize school taxes at their lowest level across Quebec, institute one income tax return for both levels of government, managed by Quebec. Good luck. Create innovation zones to foster new technology and industries. Export electricity to other provinces and the northeastern United States, not on your own. Reduce red tape for entrepreneurs and self-employed workers. We know what that means. Supply high-speed internet and cell coverage to all regions of Quebec. Good luck. Immigration. Reduce the number of immigrants by 20% a year, starting in 2019. Negotiate with Ottawa for full control of immigration. Establish a values and language test to qualify for immigration and resident status in Quebec. Those who cannot pass a French test after 3 years are flagged to Ottawa for expulsion. In education, make pre-kindergarten free but not mandatory for 4-year-olds. Eliminate school boards and school board elections. Create school service centers run by school directors, professionals, and parents. Elementary schools would hold a minimum of 2 20-minute recess periods a day. Give high school students an extra 1-hour extracurricular activity period daily. Increase number of resource teachers, speech therapists, and psychologists. Subject each school to be built to an architectural competition. I don't know what to say about that. Healthcare. Invest in screening children under 5 for developmental disorders. Ensure every child has a family doctor. Revisit the way doctors are paid. Better access to care without appointments at CLSCs during the weekends and evenings. Those are public health clinics. Hospital parking will be free for the first 2 hours, and it will be reduced to $7 to $10 a day maximum. CAQ will increase the legal age for use of marijuana to 21, offer more full-time nurse positions, abolish mandatory overtime, and revise patient-to-nurse ratios. Provide financial support for family members who care for a parent with restricted autonomy. Mandatory 2 baths a week at senior centers, double the meal budgets, and implement a silver alert system to rapidly launch searches for missing seniors. On French identity, religious symbols would be prohibited for all persons in a position of authority. There's something that just came out about that, them insisting that's going to go ahead. Of course, they mentioned hijab and kippah. I didn't hear anything about crosses. We'll see. Limit immigration in part to protect the French language. Now, as far as sovereignty goes, they're not interested in sovereignty because 2/3 of Quebecers are not interested in sovereignty. But yet they want more autonomy for Quebec within Canada and full constitutional recognition as a nation. Well, that's kind of the deal you got in 82, and you didn't want it. Appoint a commissioner of the French language to receive complaints. That is interesting, because one of the things that Couillard did was establish a commissioner for Anglophones and English language issues. So instead of removing that, we'll just make another one. Now, on environment and mobility, environment especially is something we will get to. Export more clean hydro energy to reduce greenhouse gas production in other locales. Clean up and rejuvenate the banks of the St. Lawrence River. Set aside $10 billion for infrastructure to alleviate congestion by 2030. Initiate a tramway project in the east of Montreal and on Montreal's South Shore. Extend Montreal's REM light rail system to places like Laval and Chambly. And consider running the planned Pink Line above ground instead of as a subway. There are some common issues there with what Ford has done with Toronto. There are some people afraid that Legault might try and play the same games with Montreal. But that's a general list. That's like taking everything from the campaign booklet. So, what's actually going to happen. This was worked out a little tighter. It's from the CBC, Benjamin Shingler. This is on election day. This came out. What should Quebecers expect of François Legault's coalition Avenir Quebec? More private health care and an overhaul of seniors' care. CAQ favors decentralization of the healthcare system and would allow the private sector to supply more services. It has promised to renegotiate a controversial compensation package with Quebec's medical specialists. The savings, however, are not included in the party's financial plan, indicating they aren't counting on striking a new deal with the doctors. So it's all just politics. They want to overhaul the province's long-term institutional care system with a new network of what they say would be smaller, more humane homes at an initial cost of $1 billion. The CAQ is promising to put $1.7 billion back into the wallets of Quebecers annually, primarily through allocations to families and a reduction in school taxes. Legault has promised to give families $2,400 per child annually. Right now, families receive that amount only for their first child. Legault has vowed to cut the number of immigrants by 20%, down to 40% or 40,000 annually. Under the CAQ plan, newcomers will have to pass a language and values test in order to get a Quebec selection certificate, a requirement to stay in Quebec. Legault says the change would ensure more immigrants integrate into the workforce. During the campaign, Legault struggled to explain the details of this plan and the basics of Canada's immigration policy. Quebec only has jurisdiction over economic immigrants, so Legault will need to work with Ottawa if he wants to reduce the intake of refugees and irregular border crossers, as well as the number of immigrants who come to Quebec through Canada's Family Reunification Program. Those two categories account for roughly 20% of new arrivals. Legault wants to create government-funded pre-kindergarten across Quebec. Sending all those 4-year-olds to school a year earlier will open up 50,000 spots in the public daycare system within 5 years. Critics question the $311 million annual price tag for this program and whether it's achievable, given the shortage of space already in many schools. Now, Legault wants to abolish school boards and replace them with service centers. It would provide administrative support to schools. The party believes this would give schools greater autonomy and make the education system cheaper to run. Anglophone groups have vowed to fight this change in court, arguing it would infringe on their constitutionally protected rights. Wow, I just got to step in and say, wow, that sounds like something UCP in Alberta would come up with, especially in Quebec. Wow. The CAQ says it would pass a secular charter that will go further than the Liberals' religious neutrality law. So it was Bill 62, somewhere around there. Did a show on it. Portions of which are subject to a constitutional challenge currently. The CAQ opposes the wearing of religious symbols, including the hijab, by police officers and others who wield coercive state power. The party would also ban school teachers from wearing religious symbols. So explain to me how this works in Catholic education system. Legault said he supports international greenhouse gas reduction targets, but has not been clear on how the CAQ would achieve that. The party opposes the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and the ban on the construction of new oil and gas infrastructure. The CAQ's environmental policies ranked lowest among the four main parties in a recent survey by environment groups. It's a move to the right, there's no doubt. Now keep in mind that, despite what Legault and the CAQ have said about French language tests after 3 years, Jean-Francois Lisee, as Parti Quebecois leader, said that plan is too timid, and he wanted a French language ability to be a prerequisite for immigrants to Quebec, as well as cut down to $35,000 a year. Now, not unlike the battle taking place in Ontario, a fight could be shaping up between Legault and Montreal Mayor Valérie Plante. Legault is on the record stating he thinks Montreal City Council is too large. Before the campaign started, he said he wants to come to an agreement with Plante on how to make the council more efficient, including by reducing the number of councillors. Of course, just like in Ontario, in Quebec, municipalities are the creation of the province. So he could do it. Marijuana is a big deal. Every opinion that has been garnered says uncoupling the legal age of consumption for marijuana from alcohol or the right, or something else similar is just simply asking for a constitutional lawsuit immediately. No other party has gone that route. And the quote I had in the Quebec show was a lawyer on the West Coast. I can't recall his name, damn it. But he said, if you're an adult when you're 18, but you have to wait till you're 21 to buy recreational marijuana. So you're criminalizing an entire generation of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who can buy alcohol, who can vote, who can enlist in the armed forces. It's insanity to even try it. They insist they're still going to go ahead with it. Good luck. Something from yesterday, as far as the secular charter goes. Yesterday, François Legault, this is from the Globe and Mail, Les Perreault. François Legault, the Premier Designate of Quebec, says he will invoke the notwithstanding clause to work around the Charter of Rights and Freedoms so that his government can ban people in positions of authority in the province from wearing religious symbols. The coalition Avenir Quebec leader said yesterday the plan would prevent public servants, including teachers, police officers, and judges, from wearing religious garments such as the Muslim hijab and Jewish kippah while performing their public functions. He would also amend Quebec's Charter of Rights to impose the ban. The religious symbols ban is part of a package of policies meant to protect Quebec's Francophone identity. and includes a cut in immigration quotas and language and values tests for new arrivals. In his first news conference since his party was elected to government on Monday night, Monsieur Legault justified the move to override any successful court challenge and the Canadian Charter's protection of religious freedom. He said his government will have a transition period in which people who want to continue wearing religious symbols will be offered alternative jobs. The vast majority of Quebecers would like to have a framework where people in authority positions must not wear religious signs. If we have to use the notwithstanding clause to apply what we want, the majority of Quebecers will agree. Mr. Legault was peppered for questions about his plans in his first news conference, which lasted 35 minutes. Indicated he will take a go-slow approach on many things. Promises to introduce junior kindergarten, to cut specialist salaries, and to cut taxes and fees and increase child benefits will be subject to study and deliberation. He was more resolute on the religious garment ban and his plan to cut immigration. Funny how that works. And guess who is a big supporter of François Legault? None other than Doug Ford. He's a great guy. I really like him. We share a lot of the same thoughts. He wants to cut red tape and regulation. He wants to lower taxes. We really hit it off, and I'm quite excited to meet him. Sound like anybody else you know on the political scene? Thanks, Dofo. Mr. Legault said he will have a bill to bring in mixed proportional representation within the year. Only the Liberals, reduced to 32 seats, oppose electoral reform. Still intends to raise the legal age for using cannabis to 21 from 18, but will not have time to do that before recreational marijuana is legalized 2 weeks from today, October 17th. Now, Mr. Legault, who will likely be sworn in as Premier before the end of the month, took his inspiration for the ban on religious symbols from a report issued 10 years ago by philosopher Charles Taylor and sociologist Gerard Bouchard on the accommodation of cultural practices in the province. That report suggested public service in coercive functions should not be allowed to wear religious symbols. And Dr. Taylor has since renounced that view. But yet, Monsieur Legault is using it as his justification. This is from the CBC today. Under CAQ, legal age to consume cannabis in Quebec will be 21 eventually. Ian Lafreniere, a newly elected CAQ member of the National Assembly and former spokesperson for the Montreal police, said it would be very tough to fulfill that promise before October 17th. But the party fully intends to keep that pledge and will try as much as possible to limit the transition period. The reason we announced that before October 17th is we want to be crystal clear. We don't want it to be a surprise for people. The CAQ also wants to change where pot can be smoked and amounts of possession. Already several towns and cities have announced their own bans. And it is getting fairly out of hand in Quebec. The side effect as well are people who do smoke tobacco in Quebec will now be limited even further on whether allowed to smoke tobacco. There are a lot of differing opinions coming from municipal health authorities about forcing people indoors, etc., etc. There are some places in Quebec that have banned the smoking of marijuana anywhere outside. Illegal. Nice freedoms you got. The other thing I want to cover about the CAQ that really has not been in the media is their connection to the oil and gas lobby. Go to Ricochet Media. Look up Andre Noel. He did two excellent articles, part 1 and part 2, the oil lobby's pipeline to the CAQ. I will read now from part 1 by Andre Noel. When I was a journalist at La Presse, I investigated the strategies of certain industries, including generic drugs, construction, and tobacco, and their front groups. This time, I'm interested in the oil lobby and one of its spokespersons, Yuri Chassin, former director of research at the Montreal Economic Institute, and now a candidate for Coalition Avenir Quebec. This article focuses on the links between the MEI and foundations funded by the oil magnate Koch brothers. Nicolas Hulot, France's environment minister, resigned publicly on August 28th, denouncing the influence of lobbyists on his government. The most powerful lobby is that of the oil industry, which is mobilizing around the world to dissuade states from adopting effective measures against greenhouse gases, while global warming threatens the planet's habitation. In Quebec, this lobby includes the MEI, where Yuri Chassin, now a candidate for the CAQ, was an economist and then director of research from 2010 to 2017. It is worth looking into his actions there, because he could very well have an important position in the government. This means examining the hidden face of the MEI and its relationship with U.S. think tanks backed by oil magnates, including the brothers Charles and David Koch. According to the Vancouver Observer, the Koch brothers finance MEI through their foundations. The MEI is formally associated with the Heritage Foundation, one of many that is supported by the Koch brothers and promotes oil. Everything indicates that Legault is on the same wavelength as Chassin in this regard. The Montreal Economic Institute is part of the Atlas Network, a network of pro-oil think tanks that also includes the Heritage Foundation, along with other Koch-backed groups such as the Cato Institute and the Americans for Prosperity Foundation. Political columnists highlighted Chassin's absence when leader of CAQ François Legault presented his economic squad on August 29th. This absence was strategic. Chassin had already spoken against supply management in agricultural production by the time this issue became sensitive because of NAFTA's renegotiation. The CAQ cannot afford to be lukewarm in its defense of supply management. That's why Chassin was not there. While public attention is focused on supply management, another issue is going under the radar: the exploitation and transportation of fossil fuels. Everything indicates that Legault is on the same wavelength as Chassin. When Chassin presented his candidacy in Saint-Jérôme on April 15th, the CAQ stressed that the two men have always shared a common vision for Quebec. Radio-Canada noted that the economist Chassin was already very close to the party founded by François Legault, as evidenced by his presence at the CAQ's National Congress last November. Like Chassin, the CAQ's platform favors hydraulic fracturing, except in areas where there is high population density or lack of social support. This position has remained the same even after the CAQ erased the world's oil and shale gas from its platform on August 28th, the day its opponents accused it of being a pro-oil party. Remember that François Legault has already shown his willingness to support the Energy East pipeline project if Quebec could benefit from it in the form of royalties. The CAQ refuses to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and to ban the construction of new oil and gas infrastructure. The MEI and the Fraser Institute, its counterpart in English Canada, no longer deny climate change, as did some of their researchers in the past. Now they downplay it. Chassin was paid by the MEI from 2010 to 2017, but who has financed MEI? Evidence of warming is now so obvious, even to ordinary people, that denying climate change is ridiculous. Climate skeptics 2.0 are working instead to minimize the seriousness of global warming, to deny the urgency to end greenhouse gas emissions, and to ridicule proposals and actions in favor of an energy revolution. That's what Chassin did for 7 years. He was paid by the MEI from 2010 to 17. The MEI refuses to tell who finances them. It says that 67% of its funding comes from foundations, but does not identify them. In 2011, Chassin and colleagues published a text on the MEI website where they deplored the lack of financial transparency of Quebec unions while receiving tax benefits. The MEI, to which Revenue Canada grants charitable status, also has tax advantages. Its donors can deduct donations from their taxes. The MEI's refusal to disclose its sources of funding raises questions. According to Chassin, it is not urgent to transition from oil, and global warming could benefit agricultural yields. Oh, man. The MEI is by far the most cited think tank in Quebec. In just 2 years, its full name in French, Institut économique de Montréal, shows up 4,802 times on the site eureka.cc, a media database. During the same period, the full French name of IRIS, a left-wing think tank, l'Institut de recherche et d'information socio-économique, a research group that publishes detailed but critical studies of neoliberal policies, appeared 33 times in the Eureka database. It is an understatement to say that the MEI has great visibility in Quebec media. MEI was created by economist Pierre Lemieux in 1987, but it really took off in 1999 when Michel Kelly-Gagnon at the helm. Kelly-Gagnon studied economics at the Institute for Humane Studies, IHS, a think tank funded by Charles Koch. 3 of the 11 members of the IHS board come from the Koch group. Before becoming Vice President of Operations at the MEI, Jasmine Guinette was Director of University Programs at IHS. The MEI offers $300 to cover transportation costs to any students who want to travel to Virginia to attend free IHS seminars. They are all formed according to the same mold. They employ libertarian researchers to conduct specific studies that give an academic look to their liberal doctrine. The research is published as a book or reports, widely distributed and actively promoted in the media. Mother Jones Magazine has described IHS as a haven for climate change deniers that receives funding from the Koch family foundations. In 2011, Reuters reported that Koch Industries is responsible for importing 25% of oil from the Alberta tar sands to the United States. One of its Alberta subsidiaries, Flint Hills Resources, supplies 250,000 barrels of tar sands oil each day to the Koch refinery in Minnesota. Flint Hills operates a terminal in Hardisty, Alberta, the starting point for the Keystone XL. The Koch brothers launched a campaign against President Barack Obama when he planned to block KXL. According to the National Observer, Koch Industries controls 1.1 million to 2 million acres of Alberta's tar sands. The value of its oil sands assets are in the tens of billions of dollars. A 2012 Vancouver Observer article says that donations made by the Koch brothers to the MEI were made through the foundations to which they are affiliated, namely the Claude R. Lamb Foundation and the Chase Foundation of Virginia. So this is a guy who will be in the Legault cabinet, quite possibly Minister of Energy and Mines. Who has been working on this sort of thing for a long, long time. The think tanks, foundations, and institutions identified, and many others, are a kind of nebula, more or less organized into networks. One of these networks is the International Policy Network, which has run campaigns against the science of climate change. In 2004, it received funding from Exxon to conduct climate research, which led to the publication of a book denying global warming and the need to counter it. MEI is a member of this network. Wow. Now, why did it take André Noël at the Ricochet to do this? Where is the quote-unquote mainstream media? I'll go to part 2 now. See what we have here worth mentioning. There is ample cause to look into the activities of the oil lobby. If nothing has been done in Quebec, in Canada, and in most other countries to make the changes needed to stop the warming of the climate, it is not because of the indolence and masochism of the population, but largely because of the influence of the oil lobby. It has convinced a large part of the population that the situation is neither serious nor urgent. Wow. Mr. Chassin seems to have been inspired by the new climate skeptic ideology of groups like the Cato Institute, which minimizes the dangers of global warming rather than foolishly denying them. There are all kinds of articles and papers that Mr. Chassin put his name on, being running MEI for so long. I agree with Mr. Noel's assessment. This is definitely French Canada's Fraser Institute. Wow, just ridiculous stuff. And then that made me think about something that came out on September 20th during the campaign. There was a leaked report that suggested Quebec's Green Fund was a slush fund, was set up based on the cap and trade system with Ontario and California, and it was financing green energy projects. Of course, the CAQ jumped up and down. Premier Couillard said, yeah, that's kind of why we asked for the report. We knew things were screwed. What they didn't count on was it coming public during the campaign. So, who takes advantage from that? Okay, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to get to what I've got on the USMCA. This is going to be evolving for shit, who knows how long. I was going to talk about Quebec's fixed number of seats and their first past the post deficiencies. We'll let that go. The big game reset. USMCA. It's going to take a while. As you see in the slideshow on the show page, there is a set of words that is the top of every page of this agreement, which basically says, hey, this ain't legal yet. If it changes, tough shit. This ain't gospel. So I think that's something good to keep in mind, but we can definitely look at the bigger issues. I have something here from Monday, CBC, Janice McGregor. Buried behind the cows and cars. Key changes. Rising drug costs. The intellectual property chapter includes an extension of the length of time new biologic drugs will be protected from generic drug competition. Up 2 years from Canada's previously agreed upon 8 years to 10 years. The U.S. was pushing Canada and Mexico to give 12 years. So it is a compromise. Key congressional voices in the United States wanted to see a win for the pharmaceutical industry. But down the road, Canadians will pay more for biologic drugs. It's a problem future governments will face in about a decade. Compounding existing pressures over rising drug costs at a time when the Canadian population is aging. Copyright extensions. Copyright terms in Canada currently extend for 50 years beyond the year the creator of the work dies. But the U.S. and the European Union have longer terms, 70 years after the creator's death. The USMCA will bring Canada's copyright terms in line with those in the U.S. and Europe. That might be good news for the estates of creators, but it will increase costs for those who use these works. Buy America remains. One of Canada's key objectives for the renegotiation of NAFTA was to open subnational procurement in the U.S., state and municipal level, so Canadian businesses could compete for more government contracts. Opening up government procurement was one of the most significant accomplishments in Canada's trade deal with the European Union. It holds promise for both goods manufacturers but also service providers, including small and medium-sized businesses. The Americans would concede no such win to Canada in this negotiation. Buy American rules that block cross-border procurement appear untouched by the language in USMCA. Supply management. While much attention has been paid to Canada's dairy concessions, all 5 of Canada's supply-managed agriculture sectors are giving up shares of their protected market in this deal. Dairy, eggs, chicken, turkey, and broiler hatching eggs and chicks. The egg concession, 10 million dozen additional imports, will kick in the first year this deal takes effect. Starting in year 2, the market access for American eggs will increase 1% each year for the next 10 years. The chicken concession appears to more than double the market access the U.S. negotiated in the TPP. 57,000 metric tons phased in over 6 years, as opposed to nearly 27,000 metric tons phased in over 19 years in TPP. Starting in year 7 of the USMCA, the chicken access also will increase 1% each year for the next 10 years. Canada will allow duty-free turkey to enter from the U.S. at a level equivalent to 3.5% of the previous year's Canadian turkey production. The market access granted for broiler hatching eggs and chicks is 21.1% of the Canadian domestic production for that year. All I can say to Canadian consumers is make sure country of origin labeling is a priority for you. I don't give a shit how much access to market they get. If I don't see a Canadian flag on it, I ain't buying it. Fuck you. No new professionals' visas. Another goal of Canada's negotiating team was to modernize the list of professions currently eligible for the special class of temporary work visas created under NAFTA, known as TN, Trade National Visas. It appears that list isn't changing, and no commitments have been made to increase the number of TN visas. When NAFTA began in the early 1990s, certain medical professions, nurse practitioners, for example, didn't even exist. The IT sector that employed so many skilled professionals in high demand today did not exist then. Unfortunately, IT professionals looking for easier access to visas to allow them to work in the U.S. are not any further ahead. Digital content protections. The language of Canada's existing cultural exemption is preserved. But another cultural content concern emerged during the negotiations, the fate of digital audio and video content. Could the Canadian government design future regulations or funding programs to help Canada's cultural industries thrive in the digital sphere? It's going to be hard. New language on digital content prohibits discrimination between foreign and domestic digital content. Favoritism or incentives for Canadian content could invite litigation from American or Mexican competitors. Canada is not free to block access to foreign digital content, nor could it require a foreign content creator to pay into a government program from which it does not benefit. However, Canada appears to have successfully pushed back to preserve its notice and notice system for enforcing copyright infringement online in face of U.S. pressure to adopt its notice and takedown DMCA bullshit. Canada is still notice and notice. ISDS, NAFTA's Chapter 11. The U.S. has preserved ISDS for certain sectors operating in Mexico. But in general, the Trump administration is not a fan of the system. The ability for corporations to sue the Canadian government for discriminatory or arbitrary measures that affect their business is on the way out. Civil society groups have objected to Chapter 11 for years, arguing it infringes on a sovereign country's ability to regulate as it sees fit and sometimes results in regulatory chill, where governments opt not to strengthen things like environmental or labor protections for fear of being sued. Canada agreed to drop traditional ISDS and work with the European Union on a multilateral investment court. but NAFTA-style ISDS remains in the CPTPP. So Canadian companies operating in Mexico will still have access to it if they need it. The Canadian government spoke of wanting to add an Indigenous chapter to a revised NAFTA to recognize and respect treaty rights and obligations. There is no standalone chapter on Indigenous rights in the USMCA, but there is an exemption that says nothing in this agreement shall preclude a party from adopting or maintaining a measure it deems necessary to fulfill its legal obligations to Indigenous peoples. That would appear to ensure the new trade agreement doesn't interfere with ongoing litigation over Indigenous rights or other funding or policy decisions in Canada pertaining to Indigenous people. Well, I say to you, look at what that clause says. Necessary to fulfill its legal obligations. What if the government of Canada is not looking to establish that? Then what's it worth? Oh, sorry, I like pissing on parades. Free trade with China in the future? Not so fast. This is something that's really come up big today. Among the exceptions near the end of the USMCA is language that may restrict Canada's ability to negotiate a trade deal with a non-market country, which in today's context could be interpreted as People's Republic of China. The agreement makes non-market economy a self-defining term, and the American view that China is not a market economy is well known. 3 months before starting negotiations with a non-market country, the other USMCA partners must be officially informed, and as much information as possible must be provided about the objectives of the negotiation. Before signing a new agreement, the other parties in the USMCA must be given an opportunity to review it and assess its impact on them, and to decide whether amendments are required to address concerns. Failure to do so would terminate the North American deal. This appears to require that Canada must consult with the United States in advance of any free trade talks with China. Well, never mind that if there is an actual agreement agreed to preliminarily, the United States would be able to say this has to be amended when the people of Canada can't? Whew. In a side letter, Foreign Affairs Minister Freeland commits the BC government to eliminating its rules that allow only BC wine to be sold on regular grocery store shelves. Americans had requested a panel arbitration at the WTO in an attempt to reverse the provincial government's protectionist sales policy. This side letter appears to commit Canada to proactively ending this restriction in advance of a final ruling from the WTO. That was nice of Ottawa to do that. From theconversation.com, Blaine Higgs. NAFTA has been replaced, but at what cost to Canada? Two key sections of the USMCA, the 6-year mandatory review and a limitation on negotiating free trade agreements with non-market economies, suggest that this temporary armistice with the United States and the Trump administration has been bought at a cost. That cost is placing the U.S. in a position of unprecedented authority over its neighbors' ability to craft their own domestic and international economic agendas. One of the underappreciated advantages of trade agreements for smaller countries like Canada is that they actually provide those smaller nations with more room to maneuver than they might have had otherwise. Without trade deals, larger countries like the United States leverage the promise of access to their market and the threat of restricted access to convince other countries to adopt U.S.-friendly policies. Normal trade agreements take that leverage off the table. Now, the author says, despite strong U.S. preferences for more protectionist digital copyright reforms, Canada's 2012 Copyright Modernization Act was able to implement policies that primarily reflected Canadian interests. Canada, protected by NAFTA, implemented a much less censorious form of liability limitation for ISPs, whose users upload allegedly copyright infringing material, than what the United States had hoped. That autonomy can disappear in trade negotiations. Everything is linked and everything is on the table. In the new USMCA, while Canada was able to keep its ISP liability framework, which Canadian copyright expert Michael Geist calls an easy giveaway for U.S. negotiators, Canada must now extend its copyright term to the life of the author plus 70 years. Mexico also has to adopt the U.S. ISP liability framework. The countries must also review any recommendations for action submitted by a party and decide on any appropriate actions. If a country does not confirm its wish to extend the term of the agreement at the 6-year mark, the countries must hold joint yearly reviews until the end of the 16-year term. The specter of this review would likely make Canadian policymakers hesitant about implementing policies that may upset the United States and thus threaten the entire economic relationship. This would be similar to the regulatory chill associated with Chapter 11 ISDS. This dynamic is intentional. According to a senior U.S. official, this review process will give the U.S. a significant new form of leverage to make sure the arrangement is to its liking. It will also almost inevitably invite abuse from companies seeking to change the rules to their advantage. The relief that the United States didn't make things even worse for Canada should be tempered by the realization that the moment of reckoning hasn't passed. It's only been postponed. Lovely. Now, something from the U.S. looking at this agreement. From Bloomberg, Katya Dmitrieva. Economic upside of revised NAFTA? Just avoiding downside is good. For the economies in North America, the best part of the new NAFTA is merely the fact that it exists. The relatively tepid reaction from analysts compares with a joint statement that the updated agreement will bring freer markets, fairer trade, and robust economic growth. Yeah, unicorns, rainbows. The renamed USMCA updates 1994's NAFTA with changes including higher wages for workers making auto parts and improved access for U.S. farmers to the Canadian dairy market. While economists weren't rushing to boost their forecasts for gross domestic product, they said the trade pact eliminates the downside scenario of no deal, or just a bilateral agreement, and should support expansion over the long term. In terms of the U.S. economy, the new agreement will be positive in the long run, as U.S. companies expand operations domestically, while some sectors may become more protected from foreign competition. Steel and aluminum tariffs remain, which will continue to push up prices, a near-term threat. The Conference Board of Canada recently estimated that auto tariffs, along with failing to renew the trade pact, would curb growth by 0.6 percentage points next year and 0.7 in 2020. It doesn't majorly affect the economic outlook for Canada, but what it does is limit the downside risk from trade uncertainty, which was pretty prevalent. What's been weighing on Canada over the past year is the uncertainty, and it was clouding business investment plans. JP Morgan Chase economists for Mexico said Monday that a trilateral accord was their best-case scenario. If you're looking at what they agreed to versus the baseline of NAFTA, for the United States, it's not really that much difference at all, said Jay Bryson, global economist at Wells Fargo. For Canada and Mexico, maybe it's eliminated some uncertainty there. Well, that's all I can get to for tonight. There's more, but there will be more. You know what I mean? More will be more. It's really too soon to do a detailed show on USMCA. Things will come forward when the media feels like bringing them forward. My layman's opinion could have been a lot worse. And as I said, if you're one of the people that doesn't want to see more American produce up here, you prefer to buy Canadian, then make sure you buy Canadian. The Americans can't dump. They can't price way under. Just look for logos and flags of origin. I don't care how much market access they have. If nobody buys it, who cares? What's next week? That's a damn good question. I have no idea. Maybe next week we'll talk about the USMCA. I don't know. We'll see what happens. That was it for tonight. A dead stop, a new start, and a reset. Halfway reset. Thanks for listening to The View Up Here. We'll see you next week. Good night.